today should be no stranger to any of us here, I don't think. He has graced these halls for, I believe, 20 plus years as a faculty member. And in that time, of course, he has taught very widely in the philosophy program and has published numerous books, numerous academic articles on a variety of topics. He's our, we could even say, resident expert on a wide range of topics, including perhaps philosophical personhood, philosophy of language, philosophy of miracles, relationship between faith and reason, a whole host of other topics as well. But not only is he well known and well appreciated within these walls, he is also a sought after speaker outside of these walls, having been invited to present his work at Stanford and MIT and virtually everywhere else in between, I think. So we are very fortunate to be able to have our own Father Anselm here today to speak to us about his latest research project on philosophical aesthetics. His title, as I'm sure you know, is What is Art? So join me in welcoming Father Anselm.
Michael promised me to set the bar very high so that I could only fail. Here we go. So some of you may know that I'm writing a book on aesthetics, and you may be wondering what on earth takes them so long, right? And it has been really for a while now, and it's getting bigger and bigger. But here are the reasons. First of all, I'll give you a little part of that, really the bare bones, and not even that the whole story. Because it is very long, and that in itself may be surprising. So if you're talking about the definition of art, and that's what we're asking, if you ask what is art, then people have been very skeptical in the 20th century that one could even do such a thing. There has been virtually an arms race between philosophers proposing definitions and artists basically trying to say, well, I'll show you, I can do something that doesn't fit your definition. And now that is itself noteworthy and a curious predicament, this strange kind of intertwinement of art and reflection, of art and philosophy. And there's lots to be said about that. And Hegel, yes, I do mention Hegel, Father Justin, diagnosed that as the end of art, and it has been picked up by Arthur Danto in the 20th century. And in the face of this kind of skepticism that this generates, the definitions of art also get thinner and thinner. So if you have a lot of counterexamples, you said, okay, I have to take that out of my definition to cover that. And so you make it thinner and thinner to accommodate more and more bizarre cases, basically. And at the end, your definition may become meaningless. In the face of that, my definition is very long and very substantial, therefore, not very thin at all, which is why I have a whole book to show that not only can I answer counterexamples, I can also show that it actually shows you something about art and makes you see things. Now, to straight ahead and start with the definition from the get-go, but step by step, as far as I can in the time allotted to me. So each of these steps I take to be a necessary point, a necessary condition, and together they will make jointly sufficient conditions for what art is. When it comes to Thomas' philosophy of art, sadly, St. Thomas Aquinas himself does not give us much help. One wonders what he would have written in a commentary on Aristotle's Poetics had he known it, but he didn't. Nevertheless, he does give us a definition of art as the recta ratio factibilium, the right reason of making. And that in itself already suggests to us a number of helpful things. First of all, it is an exercise of reason, the right reason of making. Art is not something we do unconsciously or by instinct. Even the employment of drugs or automatic writing by the serialists is still preceded by a conscious choice of such procedures. And even if not every movement of the paintbrush by the painter or touch of the keyboard by the pianist is conscious, this does not mean that someone paints or plays the piano unconsciously. It is not a blind process, an emanation of natural forces, or like the making of a nest or a honeycomb by animal instinct. Such natural processes usually produce the same old thing, whereas art is something that comes from a new insight and depends on our free choice to make it. There is no unconscious or involuntary making of art. It presupposes a conscious idea for a work and the free choice to create it, which is also why we can hold artists accountable for their works. That art is a use of our recta ratio, or right reason, therefore provides us with a necessary condition for the making of art. It is nonetheless not a sufficient condition. It is rather something like the proximate genus of a definition. The specific difference is provided by St. Thomas when he calls it the recta ratio factibilium, the right reason of making. And this is to be understood in contradistinction from the recta ratio agibilium, the right reason of what can be done, which concerns not art but morality, and also from the recta ratio intelligibilium, the right reason of what can be understood, which is neither art nor morality, but the speculative theoretical sciences. So here is a diagram to show that. So art is here, the right reason of making, is the right reason of doing, and the right reason of understanding, thinking. So to begin with the first one here, the right reason of thought, of theory, if you want. By contrast, art is not a mere matter of thought or theory, but a practical exercise. This may seem trivial, but it is not. Not only modern makers of conceptual art, such as Joseph Kosuth, but also Plotinus and Schleiermacher see the true work of art in the idea of the artist rather than its material instantiation. In fact, St. Thomas's definition as the recta ratio factibilium seems to do the same. Nonetheless, in all these cases, it seems to be implied that it is not an exercise of theory or philosophy, but that the telos of such ideas is to serve as a model for something to be made in the world, as external to the mind. Something like making is intended, and as Mary Mothersell points out, in spite of all the skepticism about defining art, it seems to be fairly undisputed that art has to do with making. Now, skeptics, nevertheless, may immediately try to find counterexamples, perhaps pointing to the so-called ready-mades, such as the old worn-out example of Marcel Duchamp's urinal fountain. Who of you has not seen it, or who of you has seen it before? Okay, see, that's a typical thing too. Now, Duchamp picked up this item from a factory for urinals. He did not make it himself, but he did date and sign it, as you can see, with our mud, namely with a fake name. It is still a work by Duchamp, because it is he who put it up in an exhibition, and the fake name may even make it a piece of fiction or pretense. And in doing all that, Duchamp made something after all, for he made a point, whatever it is supposed to be, likely a cynical or nihilistic one. People have argued about it ever since, and that apparently was the intention of Duchamp. He wanted to create a conversation piece. Art as a form of making is also distinct from simply doing something, so the recta ratio agibilium, which is subject to the recta ratio agibilium and ruled by morality and ethical convictions. This use of reason is prudence, as regulating our life and its forms of activity. This is arguably a presupposition in context for art as well, just as the theoretical use of reason is in turn a presupposition for all praxis. Art may be nested within theory and ethical reasoning. But these presuppositions are not yet themselves acts of making. Like art, acting is also a physical expression of an interior state. We may think of spontaneous expressions of joy in dance. Yet dancing is still a form of doing, not of making. To speak with Aristotle, it is praxis, not poiesis. I can dance, I can have a conversation, but that is not a form of making art. Putting on a ballet, on the other hand, is art, just as writing a dialogue can be a form of art. Unlike dancing, staging a ballet is the making of something. It has an identifiable product. So far, St. Thomas Aquinas gives us, therefore, some helpful parameters. And our definition of art may not even be particularly original, in spite of skeptical objections. It may give us some necessary conditions for some things being a work of art, but I think they are still not yet sufficient. For art is not the only thing that we make. If we think of all the things we make, I believe there are by and large only two kinds, and you can try to find counterexamples: tools and fine art. The Greeks called both by the same name, techne, and similarly the Latins, ars. St. Thomas Aquinas also does not distinguish these two. But I think that one of the benefits of our highly problematic and reflective history of art is that we have come to see more distinctions than previous ages. There must be, after all, a reason why God allows this problematic history to unfold in his providence. We can learn from it. The whole history of art since the ancient Greeks and Romans may in fact be read in this way, as forms of progressive dissociations, beginning in the Middle Ages with a distinction between art and religion as a byproduct of the battle over iconoclasm. This obviously would be yet another topic of its own. We can come back to that in the Q&A. The distinction relevant here is the distinction between the making of tools and the making of art. And it is not a mere distinction, but rather my claim is that the making of art presupposes the making of tools. If not in the temporal or historical order, then at least in the logical order. The various forms of art are distinct from each other because they rest on and presuppose different forms of tools and technology. What we have said so far may be illustrated in this schema, which gives the rectoratio factibilium the subdistinction between utilitarian arts or tools and fine arts, and that will be further explained. This schema means to imply that what is listed first is the precondition for what comes later on the list, with the exception of the list of tools of art amongst each other. So this list is not a temporal sequence or logical sequence. So how does the making of art relate then to the making of tools? Not all of our making is the making of art. We do not only write dramas, but also newspaper articles. We make not only sculptures, but also shells and spacecrafts. We make not only paintings, but also X-rays and other things. Each of the latter cases concerns the making of utilitarian objects, that is, of means to further ends, so tools. Any making of tools serves further purposes. Art, by contrast, functions as an end in itself. Now, when we say that, we may then be tempted to jump very quickly to notions of contemplation and beauty, and that is not wrong, for we call them, after all, fine arts or beaux-arts or the arts of the beautiful. But it may overlook some of the more specific structures in which this happens, this contemplation or beauty. After all, making conversation can be beautiful as well. and some chairs are beautiful to look at. But this may be accidental to them, and it does not make them into art. What then makes the difference? What I would like to suggest is that art is a second-order form of making, one in which our utilitarian making of tools becomes itself the concern of a further insight. We will illustrate this in a moment, but I want to notice first that this does indeed have to do with beauty, but in a different sense. For Thomas Aquinas, beauty combines the two transcendentals of the good and the true. Now, if I'm right, then we have in art a second-order combination of the good with the true. Namely, insofar as the utilitarian pursuit of the good by our tools becomes the object of a further renewed cognitive concern, a theoretical concern for a truth about its practical goodness. And this combination of the good and the true would as such satisfy the notion of the arts of the beautiful, for it embodies its own kind of beauty as productive of cognitive delight. I'll come back to this later, but for now I just want to notice that this sense of beauty is rather different from the beauty of nature, from which many Thomist authors do not differentiate it. So again, what then is the second-order form of making? There's a simple way of illustrating what I have in mind. Tool use is not unique to humans. Animals make tools such as nests, honeycombs, or spider webs. Some of them even learn to use new tools beyond mere instinctual behavior. Oops. Yeah. So a chimpanzee can learn how to use sticks to reach bananas and other things. They may even teach their offspring this kind of use and thus form the beginnings of a material culture. Now let us say that an anthropologist in a jungle comes across a bunch of sticks. How does he know whether these are tools used by an ape or by a human being? And the answer is, there's one thing that only human beings do, only they decorate tools. What does that mean? It means that the tool has become a focus of attention in its own right. The means has become an end, a thing in and by itself, as if it had a nature or substantial form of its own, independently from us. With that, it ceases to be a mere tool. Ordinary tools are what they are only as dependent on our purposes. As artifacts, they do not have final causes of their own. They embody our final causes. But they do indeed embody our purposes as external material things, rather than just leaving our purposes in our minds only. A stick may, in this way, embody the desire for a banana. Tools relate us as subjects to the objects of our desire, as to the banana. They embody our intention. But in our use of tools, the tools are not themselves the focus of our intention. The focus is the banana or apple or whatever it is, for us as well as for the ape. On the other hand, no chimpanzee is interested in the stick independently from the fruit or banana, only we are. Studies show that unlike apes, even human infants are curious about the use of tools independently from any goal that they may want to achieve. They are interested in the means independently from the ends. They play around with the mechanism of a stick in the absence of any banana. This may shed additional light on Aristotle's observation in the Poetics that we are the most imitative of all animals, and that this is how we learn as children. Children imitate the use of tools independently from any other benefit, but in a rather disinterested way. And it is this kind of imitation which is constitutive of art, or so I want to suggest. In this imitation, tools do not disappear in their use, but become the focus of a new insight in their own right. And as such, this second order making does not just conclude the sequence of right reason, but also reflects back on it, because it generates a further insight into both subject and object and into their mutual relation as embodied in the tool. So I've tried to make that into a diagram. It's a bit, I couldn't find a very good way of doing that. But you may have here the subject, and here you have the recta ratio intelligible. You have an insight based on which you may start to act. In that context, you may also then make things that relate to things out there, fruits or whatever. With art, you reflect first of all on the tool itself, but in doing so, you reflect on this whole relationship between subject and object. You gain a kind of a second order reflexive insight on your whole being in the world. Why do only human beings love art? Because we are not only aware of objects as animals are, we are also aware of ourselves as subjects in our relationship to the object. We reflect on that relationship and know ourselves as subjects in distinction from and in relation to the objects. We have a mind that does not only know, but knows that it knows. A mind that is aware of its awareness, a mind that is self-conscious. It is a mind that returns to itself in the reditio in si ipsum, as Thomas Aquinas says, from the world, from its acts of cognition and acting, and from the products of its making as well. And art does precisely that, as I will show in a moment. It makes appear how things appear to us. It discloses to us how the world is disclosed to us, and thereby makes our being in the world thematic. If this is what art imitates, then it is also not subject to Plato's criticism. Art is not about mere illusions, virtual realities, or the futile exercise of reduplicating the world. It is not about a mere appearance, as Plato thought, but, as Hegel explained, about an appearance as an appearance. When we dream that we dream, then we are awake. We cannot watch ourselves having an illusion. Contrary to Plato, imitation in art is not a mere illusion, but it can be the disclosure of how illusions work. Now, how exactly art does this will depend on the kind of art we are looking at. And the kinds of art, in turn, depend on the types of tools that we have. And these types are exactly two, practical and theoretical. And the various forms of art relate to one or the other. Painting, literature, and sculpture are based on the theoretical kind, and architecture and music on the practical kind. Now, in fact, I think I have an upgraded version. I think literature actually has both. Practical tools are physical extensions of our bodies with their needs and purposes, such as sticks, shelters, and bicycles. They can also consist in physical sound waves, such as warning signals or mating calls. Cell phone ringtones, commercial sound design, and music also fall into this category. All of these are not art, but utilitarian means to an end. Theoretical tools are physical objects that serve cognitive functions, such as passport photos, X-rays and MRIs, biology textbooks, newspapers, anatomic models, astrolabes, accounting ledgers, and encyclopedias. With John Searle, we may say that these types of tools embody two different forms of intentionality with the opposite directions of fit. Theoretical tools have a mind-to-world direction of fit, and practical tools have a world-to-mind direction of fit. And just as a footnote, I think that actually has relevant implications and may explain why that art forms developed differently in the 19th and early 20th century. The history is actually the inverse, because they're based on this inverse direction of fit. Again, that would be another talk. I just want to say there are that cashes out in some insights, these distinctions. Based on these tools, the artist the arts can be compared and contrasted in the following way. And I'm not going to explain this would take way too long. I just want to give you a sense that there's a structure to this thing, and that different also counterexamples have to be explained within the various the different kind of structures. So the differences themselves has a systematic to that can be seen as well. Let me just assure you that there are a lot of interesting, nice little things to discover on the way. One of the classical notions that I would want to revive is the notion that art imitates nature. This notion has been discarded not only by most contemporary philosophers, but also by most Thomists, including Jacques Maritain and Étienne Gilson. What imitating nature means cannot be discussed in this context. It is quite manifold. The one thing that is important to point out at this stage of our explanation is that not only our art imitates nature, but also our tools. In fact, that is the context to which Aristotle himself employs the phrase that art imitates nature. Both theoretical and practical tools already imitate nature. Theoretical tools imitate nature by representing it. Practical tools imitate nature in its operation, as Aristotle says. For example, airplane wings imitate the wings of birds in their operation. And that is indeed where engineers took their inspiration from. As a second order making and as based on this tool use, art contains these forms of imitation as well, but it cannot be reduced to it. Rather, it makes these forms of imitation reflexively thematic. Let us illustrate this with an example of practical tool use. We have already encountered the stick as a practical tool. Decoration embodies the reflection on the tool itself and makes the means into an end, something to be contemplated. This is the very essence of architecture. Practical tools are about utilitarian purposes, such as the reaching of bananas or the sheltering of human bodies. In the latter case, we will build a house. But that alone is not yet architecture. As Henry Thoreau points out in Walden, that's Henry Thoreau with his house. He points out in Walden, a toolbox would suffice as a place to sleep. And it would have the additional utility that one can carry it around as well. He is the first modernist and may have invented this very American thing, the trailer. But architecture is not just about utility, as modernism seems to think. If, as they say, form follows function, then a toolbox may be enough. But then the essential difference of art is left out. A toolbox is a tool for tools, not a tool about tools. Architecture, if you take it that way, becomes the utilitarian machine which Le Corbusier envisioned for his industrial cities, where houses are fabricated like cars. The 20th century polemic against ornament and architecture, Adolf Loos and others, is a polemic against the very character of architecture as art. Take a simple example like a wall. The Berlin Wall made no attempt or pretense at being a piece of architecture. It was a matter of mere utility, that is, something to keep people in communist East Germany. It is interesting to see that this is a provocation, not only to our human sense of justice, but also to a sense of artistry. Graffiti respond to both of these senses at once, and they could be found all over the wall. We look for something more architecturally adequate. For that, we do not need to go to the great masterworks of architecture. An older railway wall in London will do the same. I take this example from Roger Scruton's philosophy of architecture. Here we see how the vocabulary of great architecture has become a very simple vernacular of which even average architecture can avail itself. A merely utilitarian wall has nothing to hold our gaze. In fact, it repels it. It does not invite to be looked at. The London Wall, by contrast, is like a decorated tool. While it is still a wall and serves its purposes, it articulates its very purpose and makes us appreciate its role by architectural features that hold our gaze, such as the pilasters, the somehow organic swelling of the wall, the base, and something like a cornice. These features and even the material of brick articulate the wall in a humanly scaled rhythm and shape, humanly scaled shape and rhythm. They make it a focus of human interest in its own right. They articulate what it means to be a wall in human life. Similar things can be said about staircases that serve the purpose of ascending from one level to the next. In true architecture, the deeper meaning of what it means to ascend is articulated and celebrated. The central staircase in the Petit Trianon, Garden of Versailles, is a spiral staircase. And as such, it embodies a reflection on the tool of stairs and of their ascent. So if you go up a spiral staircase, you look around at where you came from. Even the light is not just a means for seeing the steps, but envisioned in its reflections on the various shapes. The way becomes the goal, and the relationship between means and ends, a relationship between part and whole. It is a celebration of the stairs themselves, as they embody the path that connects the whole of the various aspects of a human life that the architecture embodies. By contrast, the purely utilitarian conception of the same is outrightly dehumanizing, as in Le Corbusier's Unité d'habitation. You may think that this is an unfair comparison, it's a basement or something. It's not. It's not a basement. It's actually the living quarters. It's a primary living quarters for people to be in, just as the Petit Trianon. We can come back to that in a discussion if you want. Just show that by contrast. Here's another view of the same. You can also see the difference in the light and what the light is doing here as well. I'll have to leave aside music and other forms and give just one example of a theoretical tool use as well. If we consider a painting or drawing as this one by Adolf Menzel, what do we see? We see a woman, but is that all that we see? No, we also see the brush or pencil strokes, the shapes and forms that are used to make her visible. In other words, we see the medium in which she becomes visible. And this is essential to art. By contrast, I would claim with photography, which is a first-order tool. In painting, we must see both content and medium together at once in their relation, or else we do not appreciate it as art. In the case of art, our interest is not in the woman alone, but also in how the artist achieved the goal of making her present to us. To appreciate art means to appreciate both these things together and at the same time. That is the so-called twofold, as Richard Wollheim has called it. The appreciation of beauty that is specific to art is located here as well. The appreciation of, so the beauty question again. Whatever proportions we may appreciate in the beauty of nature, here it is different. It is primarily the proportion of form and content, a distinction that doesn't exist in nature. The content itself may even be ugly or immoral. Just think of some tragedies. We still may appreciate and take cognitive delight in how the artist presents this content. If, on the other hand, we lose sight of this twofold, we lose sight of art altogether. If all that we see and appreciate is the woman, then we do not see a work of art at all. We do not see a painting, but we are having an illusion. In extreme cases where we forget the tool and its function, it would be like living in the Matrix or in a virtual reality simulation. The art, as art, becomes invisible. What if, on the other hand, we only see the other side of the twofold, namely the brush strokes, or any other features that account for the medium or something how something is represented, forms, colors, and other features. Then we would have an abstract painting. Now, if you zero in on part of this picture, right, we lose the sight of the object, right, and you see just the broad strokes, you can almost think it's an abstract painting of some sorts, right? But in an extreme case, we lose art on this side as well. It would be just colors and shapes without significance, something like wallpaper or the patterns on a necktie, as Kandinsky himself suggested. It is not something we look at. Art as art becomes invisible on this side of things as well. What is needed is the possibility of holding together both the content and the medium at once. And the place where we do that is our mind. The twofold of Richard Wollheim is therefore, in fact, a threefold, and it looks like this. And this, I would now argue, in one further step, makes art, only a final step today, makes art into a form of language, broadly speaking. For as Aristotle observes, language has a triangular structure. Our words embody meaning in a physical medium, where this physical medium signifies its objects only indirectly by way of the mind that invests it with this meaning conventionally. Here too, it is the mind that holds together content on the one hand and word or form on the other. The word as a first-order theoretical tool embodies the intentionality of the mind or subject in its knowledge of the object. So this is the intentionality of the mind, and only secondary the word would participate in that intentionality, that meaning of something. In practical tools, by the way, this direction would be reversed and the object, the content, would be the function. I cannot go into that right now. But so what I want to suggest that this, what Aristotle says about language and the semantic triangle, you can map the twofold on that, and then you see that it is actually a threefold, because the twofold has to be held together by a third. That art shares in the structure makes it too triangular. Consequently, it can be suggested that it too has some kind of semantics in a broad sense, by which it can represent and imitate nature. And it means that art, like language, is, as Arthur Danto calls it, a making of meaning. This may be argued in other ways, but I will just point out two ways in which this structure is suggestive. The first brief one is that for a Thomist, it should be attractive to take Aristotle's thought on language to explain the subdivision between tools and art that are introduced in the Recta Ratio Factibilium. The second suggestion, well, the seconds of this I'm going to skip in the interest of time. You want to can come to that somehow. So in that sense, let me stop here in my outline. Just show you what that amounts to as a definition, right? You see, it's a long definition. It's not a thing, and I can explain all of it. I have tried to put it in a pithy kind of form with the 4 Aristotelian causes, but it's not pithy if it's a very complex long sentence then. But I just take this right now just to briefly summarize some of the points, right? So this part can say functions a bit like approximate genus and specific differences. So you have, it's a form of right reason. And among those, it's the right reason of making something. And then there's the subject distinction of a second order form of making. So that's the nice typical kind of structure that you would like. The rest doesn't exactly function that way because it's not subdividing things, but it's coextensive with what you arrive at here. Nevertheless, it does articulate further necessary conditions for some things being hard. So it's the making of intrinsic meaning or purpose, because now the tool, as I said, becomes an end in itself, something to look at in its own right. And in that sense, something analogous to a natural organism, one can argue further for that, but that's one of these claims. And then, as I just said, with the triangular structure, the kind of twofold that is involved is creating something like a semantic triangle, which makes it language-like. That was about as far as I got. Then I would need to explain, how there are different senses in which art imitates nature. One has to make a number of distinctions there as well. And then the kind of appreciation that goes with that, I have hinted at that with the relationship between form and content and what might appreciate them. And then, of course, the telos, the final cause of the whole thing, which has to do with a further reflection on the beauty of the universe, its maker, us as makers, the upbuilding of the human community, and so on. There's lots of things in there too, which I cannot do. But I just want to give you a sense that what else is there if I had more time, right? So it's a thick description, a thick definition, and gives you a lot of things to shoot on right now. There's finally that sentence here. No? So art is the making of a language in which a cognitive or practical medium is thematic as a tool for it, in the interplay of content, medium, and maker, of which each of these, or the whole interplay, imitates nature in a threefold way in order to disclose them in their most luminous, that is most beautiful form for communal appreciation. So obviously the making is the efficient cause here. And insofar as it takes the first order tools as that which it reflects on, and it gives further comment on, or if you want, makes that the material cause. And if that imitates something, and that can be further elaborated, that's the formal cause. And the appreciation that results from that is the final cause. So there you have it. And now you can give me your feedback, criticisms, and questions. Thank you for your attention.
We have a fair bit of time for some questions and comments, so we'll also.
Yes.
Thank you for that. I don't know where this fits in your schema here, but if UA, like you mentioned, is sort of a combination of truth and goodness, and based on your other diagram showed us of like where ethics fits and then where fine arts or art. Have you ever thought of the relationship between morality and art? So I'm thinking more of like a morally good artist and a horrible bad artist, and how that affects the products or outcomes they have from their, like, coming from like them into their art.
Yeah. The moralists, the immoralists, and people who try to do something in between. I think these categories don't help because you actually have to distinguish a number of cases. I'm not prepared to talk about that. A long chapter over that. I couldn't even recall all of that right now, but there is a process in which art comes about, and it matters what you're looking at. I mean, for one, you have to distinguish form and content, right? So there is a moral way in which you can depict immoral content. But there's also in the process something in which, say, the artist sets himself up for making work. So if you're taking drugs for that, that could itself be immoral. And you can ask yourself, well, does that affect the artwork itself? Or can we abstract from that? On the other end of these things, the reception end of things, you can ask, well, say the Nazis used and abused, say, the music of Bruckner, right? Does that make Bruckner something bad? Probably not, So in some cases, you may be able to abstract from certain elements, in other cases not. What if Wagner uses Louis II of Bavaria to finance his operas and treats him in a shameless kind of way? Does that affect the operas? Maybe, maybe not. What about, you see, there was, Or if you use your friends to depict them in a novel under a different name, but everybody knows anyway who it is. Right? Well, that happens, not rarely. Is that immoral? Thomas Mann did that with Gerhard Hauptmann in The Magic Mountain, and he felt obliged to send him a letter, of apology for that. So he didn't think that was a good idea. Now, does it affect The Magic Mountain and its aesthetic qualities? Maybe not. No. But if, let's say, the form follows an immoral content in such a way that it becomes a propaganda for this immoral content, then it doesn't affect the aesthetic quality of that, then becomes an evil work of art. Can still be art, maybe not good art, but it's evil art. Yeah.
Kind of a similar question, but on the other side, how does the kind of moral effects of art, like catharsis or something like that, fit into the purpose of art without making it a means? It still has a character of an end, but in some sense, it's done for its effect on the recipient.
Yeah, that's the whole mystery of what catharsis actually is,
Yeah.
And I think the experience of catharsis is the experience of some redemptive element. It's sometimes hard to tell what it is. You have a stage littered with dead bodies, and there's a sense of catharsis.
Yeah.
What's that about exactly? I don't have a final answer to that. I think there may be in ever so apophatic ways, even in a tragic worldview, some redemptive element. In Christianity, I don't think we have this tragic worldview. I think if it would end like a Greek tragedy, we would think there's something not quite right. But that may be the case for much of modern art too. So yeah, but definitely the catharsis is not just showing you voyeuristically some evil on the stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have questions on where what's considered art and what isn't. So we'll take a look at art movements such as like absurdism or cubism and surrealism or what have you. At least to me, like the lines start to get blurred between like how is that even art or what have you? Because it's like a postmodernist way of thinking the Bible movie. So I'm curious what your opinion is on if we consider that art at all.
So two things. One, I would not make any blanket statements. So you have to look at individual cases. Artworks are individual things and they come from individual contexts and artists. And it depends, it really just depends. That doesn't mean that certain ideologies couldn't be problematic, surrealism or something. I would also try to accommodate as much as possible of that. I don't have to agree that something is a good work of art if I say that it is a work of art. If you make a definition that is so restricted that you have to cast out half of the 20th century, people will not find that very plausible, and probably rightly so. So I think you will want to be able to accommodate a lot of these things. You still don't have to call it good art, but again, what that means you have to discuss in each case. The second thing is we have given the artists a lot of authority. And our whole sets of definitions of art that avail themselves of that. So some people throw up their hands and say, we don't know what art is anymore based on what intrinsically an art is that you're looking at, right? The work. And so you define it as artist does what an artist does. So you take something extrinsic to the artwork to define it. So which means then whatever an artist does is art. Now, that is a circular definition, because what makes the artist an artist? Well, that he makes works of art. So you have to know what a work of art is, first of all, to know what the artist is. So I give a circular definition, but it's one of these external definitions that come from that kind of desperation. You have the same thing on the other side, on the reception side of things. People appeal to the art world as an arbiter. So art is what museum curators decide goes into the museum. or what people are willing to spend money on an auction or something like that. That's not a very good definition of art, but you can tell when people are desperate and are looking for other explanations because they don't find intrinsically any way to define art. Both are extrinsic forms, and both are appeals to authority. And the argument of authority is not a very strong argument, let's say. And definition from authority is similar. And again, on top of that, person is sorry. So I don't think we have to accept everything that artist produces and claims to be art. I think there's a way of pushing back against that. To what degree we should be doing that is another question. But I think.
Thank you. I guess I want to push back a little bit on the maybe I'm more sympathetic to our CEO citing. Speak up. I guess yeah. I want to push back on the last argument, I guess.
Yeah.
So that the appeal to authority is not a great way to sort of think about what art is through the final cause that you propose. So if part of what art is involves communal appreciation, two things. One, what exactly do you mean by appreciation? Say something more about that. And then let's posit a situation where an artist makes something, but it never gets seen. Is it not yet art? Or maybe he puts it out into anything, but it doesn't, there's a village of Philistines and nobody cares. If appreciation is part of the definition of art, then that would seem to at least partially root what art is in its reception. And so if there's a receiving community that says, well, look, this is great art, then that would seem to put some leverage for communal sort of social.
Yeah, I mean, it is the telos of art, right? Now, an artwork can fail its telos. It's still be an artwork. A bad doctor is still a doctor. And a bad artwork is still an artwork. But it can fail also for various reasons. So people can fail to appreciate. But even that you can say that it fails to appreciate it means that intrinsically it is something worth appreciating. And therefore intrinsically it is a work of art, even if these are all Philistines or has disappeared in a closet or something like that.
What do you mean? Maybe just this more kind of abstractly or precisely. What do you mean by appreciation? Is this
so
there are different levels of appreciation, but it seems to imply something major?
Some of these theories have struggled and wrestled with this what appreciation means and didn't find a good way of articulating that, and therefore threw it out. So, for example, people says, well, what kind of appreciation? You know, I can appreciate food, friendship, whatever. You know? How is art specific? Well, it must be aesthetic appreciation. And then the question, well, what's that, right? And then if you try to define that, you get again another circle of definition, because in some way you have to appeal yet to what art is doing. It's the kind of appreciation that art is there for, and so on and so on. And then you have another circle of definition. I would, at that point, talk about the appreciation of beauty, good old beauty. That's, of course, what most modern thinkers have thrown out for further reasons that one could discuss. But of course, then you can be asked, what do you mean by beauty? But I think that Thomas has a response to that. And so Thomas Aquinas does talk about beauty and what defines beauty, integrity, proportion, splendor, and things like that, clarity. That can be further explained and can be metaphysically defined and so forth. I would then add to that what I said earlier, that what Aquinas says clearly applies to beauty of nature. Here we have to make some further distinctions, but the same criteria would apply here as well. So if you have a robust sense of, or robust definition of what beauty is, which metaphysics helps you to do, then you can talk about appreciation as an appreciation of beauty. Right? And then you don't go in a circle. And you can defend the definition of that solid.
So someone who notices whatever, notices the beautiful features of an object is appreciated.
Yes, that's. Yes.
So this idea of second order making a really pregnant concept when you understand your art. Wonder if you could use it to help understand sort of the development of arts, modern times. Because if it's a second order reflection on making, making, in the 17th century when you have the invention of this concept of ozone. That's also the time when crafts were very diminished and started to be reconceived as applications of mathematics. So, wonder if you could then say that robbed art of the making, on which it was the second order reflection, which then led to its sort of spinning off into museums, which were being constructed at the time. It was then, because it lost its object, it became an expression of the artist, which is why it's only then they would start having signed art.
That's right.
Right?
Well, that's also a little earlier. Yeah, but yeah.
Yeah.
So this is part of the history of dissociations that I hinted at. Very elements to that. But as an early beginning of splitting art from religion, the iconoclasm debate. But in the early modern age, you find other things. So the arts indeed separate themselves from tool making. So artists usually were in the workshop with all the other tool makers and craftsmen as well, building cathedrals and all that. Now you have academies. You have a professionalization of art in which you learn specific skills that does goes for the arts of the beautiful. And at the same time, you have in these specializations, you have specializations among the artists, and even the so-called paragona, the debate among the artists, which of the art is the highest, and they start to split from each other. And it just continues from there, and then you get to the separation of art from life more generally. As you said, putting it in museums. That's at the time of Hegel. Hegel sees it at the end of art. There's more to that, but they built that museum right on the other side of the street where Hegel lived, and it was Schinkel building this museum. And what's the modern kind of museum like? You go in and you walk through it as you walk through the ages. The artwork is arranged chronologically. So you walk through history, the space becomes a temporal kind of thing. So you walk through history, look at all the ages, and you are part of none of them. So you're standing outside of the history of art. You are not yourself part of a living tradition anymore. And the artist, at the same time that artists are thought of which style should be built, or architecture should be built. There's a book recently with that title, in 1810 or something. You do have Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy unearthing Bach's St. Matthew Passion and performing it as a concert. And everybody was there, Schleiermacher, Hegel, everybody, right? And it was, but that was not what people usually did. They composed their own music in each age. Now you have a historical approach, and you have the concert hall, basically. And so that's true for all the art forms, and it's a very peculiar modern predicament, but it speaks to the separation of art and life. And then you can go further. I mean, so the arts separate from each other, but within the arts, they separate their own elements. So you have the fight of the classicists against the romantics. One emphasizes drawing, the other one emphasizes color. One may be more Protestant, the other more Catholic, but they split and they form parties along these lines. But these are two elements that belong to the art of painting, and they have to be taken apart. Music separates from words. They talk about absolute music at that time. So Beethoven's symphonies are an example for that. You have architecture expelling painting and sculpture eventually. You have painting expelling its third dimension, the depth dimension that the Renaissance especially had emphasized. So Clement Greenberg, and Clement Green, the famous art critic in New York, who defended abstract expressionism, Mark Rothko, Bernard Newman, all these people. And then here was the flatness of the surface. That's the telos of painting, is the flatness of the surface, because that's the medium. So the medium itself becomes the message and the goal. And so you have to emphasize the flatness of the canvas. So what do you get with that? You expel the element in painting that has an affinity to sculpture. And because we are not sculpture, that's for you, so we must be flat, right? So you dissociate in one of these many dissociations, and they have their own kind of dialectics. For example, let me show you something. I can. So people have pointed out, and it's true in many cases, that if painting ejects the object from it, becoming abstract, then painting itself becomes an object. And this is Frank Stella. They had an exhibition once in the Palace of Legion of Honor where you could see the development of this work, very interesting. And one of the things that you have, people get rid of the framing, because the framing, as Alberti says, is a window in another world, right? And so you have the naked canvas, but it's also lifted off from the wall. It becomes like more object-like. It's very flat, but it's at the same time itself an object on the wall. And that's not where it ends. And so you see how it becomes more sculptural. And that's still not where it ends. It comes off the wall in many ways. Right? And finally, is that still painting as a sculpture? Right? But there's a logic to that. So you can see that. So if the arts dissociate from each other, they also sometimes flip-flop into each other. So this is just one example. But there are many kind of dissociations of that sort. I think they're helpful because they help us to see certain things, including these kind of dialectics that we wouldn't see otherwise. But this is very much for our mind and our reflection to see. So it makes it a very philosophical enterprise, and that's what Hegel thought is happening. Basically leaving behind art at the end.
I think we're gonna have to stop it there, actually, we are at time.
Yeah.
However, the conversation can continue, outside these doors. So let's thank you, thank you. Before we leave, I want to mark the calendars. Our next seminar will be on November 12th. We'll have Professor Anna Marcosian here. So don't want to miss them.
Would you like to say something about the
Can I say something briefly?
Yeah.
He's Professor Ned Marcosian is a professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And he specializes especially in the philosophy of time. And I think here he's going to be talking about the material constitution of objects. So connected with substance ontology, I think he's going to try to engage not anamorphous, but he's going to try to engage us with anamorphism to some extent.